Alright, I think I'm at the point where I can kind of showcase this build. We're currently playing the Sever Darkness build, but I'm going to have timestamps down to everything below. I'm going to show you the stats, the gear, the way I currently have my Paragon board. I will be generating and then updating the Maxroll guide that's currently in the works for this endgame build, so a lot of that is going to look a lot more optimized than what you're going to see in the video itself right here, but it's to give you the general idea of what a Sever Necromancer looks like. So let's get some gameplay footage, then I'll go over the skills that we use, the skill points, we'll go through the Paragon system like I said, and we'll kind of go bit by bit, breaking it down so you can see that. So the game plan's pretty simple. It's very similar to other builds, except it gets to rely on a lot more additional safety and damage output that other ones don't normally get to. One, our corpse explosions actually do something. As you can see right there, huge amounts of crits coming from the Shadow Blight passive. We also use Decay to increase that damage. We are a crit heavy build, so we also get to rely on our Sever being able to crit on packs. And then when everything else fails, you just drop a ton of corpse explosions on everything within its area. Bone Storm is also considered a shadow spell, so that's really powerful for us because it's going to apply a ton of stacks of Shadow Blight simultaneously. And then Corpse Explosion really does a ton of heavy lifting here. Not only that, we're able to generate Fortify because we're going to have Corpse Tendrils up a whole bunch, and we use the Blood Drinker glyph to be able to do that. So like Bone Storm is simultaneously like a damage and a defense skill like it typically is, but we benefit a lot more out of it. Corpse Tendrils brings in a huge amount of survivability and crowd control. Sever itself is one of our ways of actually applying vulnerable. So this often is a lot more like an activator for our corpse explosion damage. The best part about this version of the build, or what I like about the Sever version of the build, is that typically putting a bunch of critical strike damage and critical strike chance onto your build to get the Shadow Blight proc to do more damage is fine, but an afterthought. But since Sever is a skill that hits 4 times and each one of them can crit, the critical strike from Grasping Veins from that aspect is also really good on it to help pump out more damage. The Shadow Blight ends up doing a ton of damage. It doesn't really have a lot of dead stats. Basically every stat is good on the build, even though it's predominantly, a damage over time build, and you would typically want to be distant in a lot of different scenarios. It still benefits from getting up close and personal, being a pseudo melee build as well. So here we have the Elite. A lot of builds that do pretty good against density tend to kind of suffer up against elites. Sever just kind of walks up and does what it does regardless of the monster type that it's fighting. Set up with Corpse Tendrils, get your Corpse Explosions going, trigger a bunch, drop in with Sever for the rest of the damage. Simple dimple. And then you dump in with Sever for the rest of the damage, and you complete the dungeon. So that was a tier 49 dungeon on what I would describe as like very bad gear and a very bad setup for the build as it stands right now, and it never really faced any issues there. We were never really like scared of the monsters. So that was tier 49, meaning the monsters were level 103, so 11 levels higher than us, able to push pretty well on a level 92 character. I don't even have all of my glyphs for the character set up yet, so let's go ahead and take a look at it. A lot of what you're going to see, you could mix and match where these aspects are. We need so many aspects that we're actually using a one-hander and an offhand, because we need that many more additional offensive aspects to be able to play it in a way that I think is like the most fun while also having the most tools available to it. So just to start, again, remember any of these offensive aspects could really move to any other part of the gear. And the only one that I think is like really stuck is I think that you should have a Maxroll Blighted on a really good amulet. Blighted says after Shadow Blight procs 10 times, we're going to get a massive amount of multiplicative damage for 6 seconds. And this is where you see the vast majority of our damage come out, either from the Blighted Corpse Explosion procs or from our Bone Storm procs. This thing stacks so much damage for us so quickly that is absolutely required, and I think putting on the amulet is the only thing that makes sense. For the amulet, you're looking for anything that says damage reduction as well as more damage reduction or more damage, and then plus to gloom is a really nice passive here. Essence cost reduction could be nice. Additional survivability could be nice. On the ring, we're currently using Fast Blood for Blood Orbs, reducing the cooldown on our Bone Storm, since Bone Storm is such an amazing tool for being able to stack all of our procs as quickly as possible while consuming corpses to proc Flesh Eater and Fueled by Death, get us a bunch of essence. It's just kind of like a must-have in my opinion, and if you don't have this yet, you could easily slot in something like Umbral, which I'm actually not even using on the build at this point because I really don't think it suffers at essence generation, since our biggest damage output is from Corpse Explosion, and we already have Corpse Explosion generates essence. So doubling up on essence generation would make you cast Sever more often, but I don't really think that that's the optimal playstyle. This one has some wiggle room. Osius Gale is going to increase the total length of time of Bone Storm for 8 seconds, but it also eats corpses. So this often will lead to a problem where you still have Bone Storm up, but you want to engage onto the next monster, but you can't create a corpse because it's still eating corpses. So you can't start with corpse tendrils. So it requires you to be like very conscious of how many corpses you have consumed. And I think in this spot, it would be very easy to either swap into a different offensive aspect. I also want to be using the Blood Mist leaves behind a trail of shadow damage, which isn't super important for the build. It can help to increase the rate that you generate Fortify if you select that on Blood Mist, which actually makes it really nice as a survivability tool on top of the Unstoppable and Immune. But what it also does is it removes the movement penalty from Blood Mist. And then if you also use the mobility aspect on your boots, which I do not currently have, which says that when you become unstoppable in 4 seconds after you gain up to 20% movement speed, Blood Mist all of a sudden actually becomes a mobility skill for the Necromancer, and you don't feel like you're really like sacrificing a slot just for the survivability. So you could easily slot that offensive aspect here if you really wanted to. I don't currently have one available, and I had a perfect Osius Gale, so I'm currently using this. For the helmet, Disobedience, best defensive aspect, no question. For the armor, as much damage reduction as you can possibly stack on this character, as well as either damage or shadow damage. And then I'm currently using Protector. You can put a utility aspect here, and we're probably going to have to. I'm going to have to move my Explosive Mist utility aspect up to the chest, so I can put the mobility after gaining Unstoppable onto my boots. But since I don't have those right now, Protector is just free. I know a lot of people don't value this very highly. I would gladly like to have 6,000 bonus life when I engage on an elite or a boss. I don't see how this is a bad thing. Literally, if you have nothing else, this is directly from the Codex of Power as well, and it scales with the item power that you put it on. So you don't even get this minimum roll, you actually just get a really high value version of it, even when you use it from the Codex. So I think it's a good aspect. For the gloves, you're probably asking me why am I not using Howl from Below? I do have Howl from Below. I think that Howl from Below is fantastic. It's good for scaling Corpse Explosion damage. I think the half of the total damage output that we're using is Corpse Explosion, so don't get me wrong, I think that that is a great option. But as I've said multiple times, we need a ton of offensive aspects on this build to make it as efficient as possible. So throwing away the glove slot to not be able to use that, I don't think is necessary. On top of that, your gloves can get you 4 more ranks to Sever, and as you can see here, I have attack speed, lucky hit chance, and crit against injured enemies. Crit against injured enemies isn't the best, but it helps to round out the end of a fight where you're typically running out of resources, which is, in my opinion, like a decent enough stat. And then we're using Grasping Veins here for Corpse Tendrils because that gets us crit chance and crit multiplier damage. So when we have this up, the Shadow Blight proc is able to crit more often and deal a ton more damage. Our Bone Storm is able to crit and do a ton more damage. And then our Sever itself, which is a high crit valuing skill, has a ton of additional damage on it as well. So if I were to lose any one of the aspects, it might be Grasping Veins, but it would probably be one of the ones that I'm like the most sad to see go. For the pants, as much damage reduction as you can possibly get, and I personally like ranks to Blood Mist here to bring down its cooldown. Blood Mist has an incredibly high cooldown, so even at rank 5 from our item contribution and our cooldown reduction, it's still greater than 18 seconds, which does get brought down by the Explosive Mist aspect, so that's about 2 seconds off. It doesn't even always trigger for corpses. It's actually really inconsistent when it triggers corpses. And until you have something like Black River, I think that this underperforms as it currently is. So I want to have as many ranks as possible to get that cooldown reduction as low as possible. We're also using Shielding Storm as just like the second best possible defensive aspect that the Necromancer has available. If you're using Bone Storm, which you probably should be doing on just about every single build, it basically says you have just like permanent barrier as long as it's up, and the more monsters there are, the safer you are, because it's continuously regenerating barrier off of every target hit. For the boots, anything that says plus to Corpse Tendrils to have a lower cooldown on this is really powerful, because we basically want to set that up all the time to generate the Blood Orbs, to have Bone Storm up more often, also gaining the additional crit and the crit damage, and then just having monsters slowed and stunned for that long is incredibly powerful. We're also using it to generate more Blood Orbs, because that's how we proc our Blood Drinker in our Glyph socket for survivability. But then movement speed after killing an elite, and then I personally like evade grants movement speed, especially for traveling through town, because it's just really, really fast, gaining 75% movement speed, oddly enough. I know a lot of people use multiple charges on evade, and I think that just comes down to a playstyle thing, but I personally like it when I evade and then I get the zoomies for that full second. It feels really good. For the weapon, I'm kind of going back and forth between either like a wand, a dagger, or a sword. Wand's going to get you lucky hit chance, which is going to make all of our lucky hit proc chances go up higher, generating more corpses with hewed flesh, generating crippling darkness more often, etc. That being said, a sword would get you critical strike damage, which is obviously good on our build, and a dagger would get you close damage. So even when you are not critting and when you are doing damage with something like corpse explosion, that's going to help as well. For stats here, I currently have damage to crowd control, damage over time, crit damage, and damage to injured enemies. I think these are okay. I personally would like to see vulnerable damage on this, and kind of in any slot where you can get vulnerable damage, that would be nice since it's an ultimate multiplier of all of your damage. Yes, that increases like corpse explosion damage and shadow blight proc damage. I see a lot of people kind of reporting that they think that it doesn't. It just does. That is how it works. Vulnerable damage multiplies any damage that you apply. So obviously it's very strong. We're using Ultimate Shadow to turn Bone Storm into a darkness skill as well. Not only is it just going to like increase the likelihood of you proccing all of your various lucky hit abilities from darkness skills, but it adds on a ton of additional damage and procs Shadow Blight at such an amazing rate. And then for our offhand, I'm currently using a focus so I can put an additional offensive aspect on it, and that's where I'm putting Decay. Decay is going to increase the Shadow Blight proc damage from the 22% of its base up to 200% additional, so it's going to increase it by a 200% multiplier once you have full stacks on it, and then again, that damage itself can crit. We have crit chance, lucky hit chance, damage reduction while we're fortified, and we're basically continuously fortified, and then increase crowd control duration so that we're able to benefit from corpse tendrils, keeping us safe for longer. For the Book of the Dead, sacrificing Reapers so we get the additional shadow damage, sacrificing Cold Mages so we get the additional vulnerable damage, and then sacrificing Golem to get the additional crit damage. For the skill tree, I'm not 100% married to the setup that I have right now. You could move a lot of these points around to get better like overall functionality and optimization out of the build, but we are using Acolyte's Reap to be able to generate a corpse. For a while, I was using Blight, and then Blight pulls in targets, and just actually using Blight as an activator of hewed flesh to generate corpses, and the inconsistency of not 100% of the time generating a corpse when I need to just was too much for me to handle. Full into Sever. Sever generates vulnerable, 3 into hewed flesh because corpse explosion is our major damage, and then I am currently using Imperfectly Balanced. I don't think you need to do this, and you could save 4 points here, which you could put elsewhere for more cooldown reduction, but as of right now I'm still using it because I do think it's a Sever build, so we should probably focus on making Sever as good as possible. We're using Blood Mist, and Blood Mist generates corpses. This is kind of nice, especially when Bone Storm and Osius Gale is messing up how many corpses you have available. Pull into Corpse Explosion, over to Blighted Corpse Explosion, and then 3 into Grim Harvest, 3 into Fueled by Death. We are using 3 into Death's Embrace. We're typically close as opposed to far the vast majority of the time. I currently have my dump points into Corpse Tendrils because I'd like that cooldown to be as low as possible, and then we go up to Blighted Corpse Tendrils to generate the Blood Orbs for Blood Drinker, like I've said now 1,000 times, but every time I don't say it 1,000 times, people ask me why we're using it, and that's why. Only 1 point into Reap, only 1 point into Crippling Darkness, and then Max Gloom and Max Terror. If you haven't seen my video recently on how often Crippling Darkness realistically procs off of stuff like Corpse Explosion, I don't personally think that it's super important to max this out. I think that Crippling Darkness is obviously a great tool. It's there, it helps to apply stagger, but I don't know where you would put other points out just to slightly increase the stagger that you generate from this, considering the vast majority of times, other than on literally a boss, every monster is near permanently stunned or we are immune. So I don't think that like the survivability increase here is worth the additional points. Then going down into Bone Storm, 3 points into Standalone, 3 points into Memento Mori, and then Shadow Blight to cap it off. I have what I can only call the ugliest Paragon board right now, and I also think that it is very suboptimal. Like I said, the Maxroll guide is going to have a much better version of it, but I've been like near perpetually in gold debt because I've needed to test out so many builds, and I was just able to respec my board today to be able to add on Wither. So stay with me here. I don't think that every option I've made here is the best option, but they are very good, and they just produce the results that you saw. So we're going to build into control in our starter board since it has so much intelligence available to it. That's going to give us a ton of damage to crowd controlled enemies, and then we also deal damage to slowed and stunned monsters, which we're basically applying near 100% of the time with all of our shadow abilities and corpse tendrils. I path up to rare to be able to pick up the additional nodes here, and then we actually path out of preservation, picking up all armor nodes. Then I build into Flesh Eater board. You might build into Wither as your first board. That would not be wrong. I need to be able to only respec the last board so I can keep trying out different builds, but Flesh Eater is obviously fantastic on this build. We head over to Stifle for the damage to injured and crit damage. We obviously pick up Targeted as well, and then I am building a little bit into resistances in my board. It doesn't need to be a high priority since they're obviously very bad, but I do think even picking up like 1 or 2 rare nodes that have resistances in them basically means you've done as much as you can possibly do, and then you literally should not worry about resistances anywhere else. For our second glyph, I'm currently socketing in Blood Drinker. This is how we generate Fortify, this is how we stay alive, and then it also does give us additional magic node bonus, so we're getting more damage to elites, more dex, and more res, and then I do walk over to Color just to be able to pick up the increased attack speed. Increased attack speed is good on every build. I think every build should use this. Pathing out of the left, we're going to build into Scent of Death. Scent of Death is great. If you have 2 corpses around you, you have damage reduction. So if you've started the fight, you have damage reduction. If you haven't started a fight yet, you have increased damage. It's a win-win all around. It also means that you can start a fight, get that damage reduction, set up Bone Storm, which cleans up all the corpses, and now you gain even more damage until the next couple monsters die. So it's just really good. Building into Ruin, damage to healthy, crit damage. Can't say it enough, absolutely love this. Obviously you should be hitting all of these dex requirements. Again, super scuffed boards, don't judge me. Then we put darkness into this board right here. The added shadow damage is nice. Again, it does work with corpse explosion, and then whenever you deal shadow damage to an enemy, they're going to deal reduced damage. So the moment that you set up a single corpse explosion, you're basically fine, and now all monsters are just doing 10% less damage to you. That's pretty great. Build over to Preservation and pick up all armor nodes, and then I build into Deathmark and I pick up every node here since we do need that willpower for the glyph itself. Pathing out of here, we're finally building into Wither. Again, this might be your second board, that would be perfectly fine. I just need to be able to swap this out and stop spending 6 million gold every time I need to try a new class and setup. Building into Dragging Shadows for the damage reduction is just very good here. Obviously pick up the legendary node. Building into Lingering Shadows, pick up everything here. Build into Gnawing Darkness, pick up everything here. And then over into the glyph, we're socketing Scourge. My Scourge isn't rank 15 yet, so this is super underperforming, but we'll be able to stack a ton of shadow damage over time, and then we deal additional damage to any target that is affected by shadow damage over time. I'm not building into the Gloom node. You just don't need to. I don't know who would build into like a shadow resistance specific node, but it's here if you wanted it. Then we're building over to Malediction and picking up all the nodes in this cluster. And then we're maxing out willpower so that when my glyph is actually big enough to get all the bonuses, we'll already have it, so I don't have to worry about that later. You'll see I have a willpower node here, a willpower node here, already built up into this section, so I don't need to worry about it later. There you go. That is my Sever build. Like I've said, and I'm going to repeat here, I'm going to have an updated and optimized like board setup and gear setup on Maxroll. The 2 aspects I really want to get onto here is Blood Mist no longer slows you down, and then movement speed after Unstoppable to drastically increase our overall mobility. And there might be a world where I drop Grasping Veins. I'm not exactly sure. It kind of depends on how my gear like plays out right now. There is also a great setup that uses a 2-handed sword to get the biggest bonus, a 240% bonus out of Shadow Blight. It also just gives you a lot of like base stats, like really high vulnerable, really high crit damage, really good just like overall damage and stats for it. I don't think that that is required, but it's definitely a way that you could play the build, and I don't think that you're wrong for doing it. You just probably wouldn't be able to fit in as many aspects to work together with both either Blood Mist or Bone Storm. You'd kind of have to pick one or the other to optimize and prioritize there. You should probably prioritize the movement speed if you're looking to speed farms. That would be the Blood Mist aspects, or you should prioritize the Bone Storm if you're looking for more survivability and more damage and push higher into dungeon tiers. There's also the unique boots that leave behind a shadow trail off of Sever, and it was fine. Like, they're not bad boots, don't get me wrong. And they also help in the early game to add on like a bit more damage and to proc Shadow Blight a bit more effectively. But once you have Bone Storm as a shadow skill and you have like good uptime on Corpse Explosion, the boots basically do nothing. And then the only other thing that I can really think about is the aspect for Empowering Reaper. Empowering Reaper, like on paper, is pretty cool. It says if you crit, you have a chance to also cast Blight for free. Casting Blight for free, you could actually put the points into the skills, and not only would it cast that rank of Blight, but it would also gain, you know, Blight applies Immobilize or Blight increases your damage. But we're now talking about a place where if you crit, you have a small % chance to cast a low level Blight skill, which is okay. If you also mix that in with the Blight pulls in monsters, it gives Sever this like a little bit of additional CC option. I don't think that's the worst. I just don't think that it's optimal, and realistically is not going to proc that much unless you have permanent uptime on Bone Storm. And then the question becomes like, where do you put this to get the biggest chance? You would need a two-hander. You're definitely not going to remove Blighted from your amulet to get the biggest chance, so it ends up going on to like a ring or your offhand. And would I rather have more mobility, more overall damage, more decay damage, or would I like Sever to sometimes cast Blight? That just doesn't really work for me. But again, if you have it, it's definitely just like free bonus damage in crowd control for very little investment, and it is a cool way of playing the build. But I did want to touch on it because I know people will ask, and if you're personally using it, I don't think that you're wrong. It's just, again, in no way, shape, or form optimal or realistic to rely on it. It also only happens once every 3 seconds, which feels a little bit disrespectful. Maybe that's just me. But I hope that you're finally able to either use this guide if you haven't built into Sever yet, either, you know, pick and choose some stuff that you wanted out of it, saying, oh, I didn't think about that, or I've included this or whatever. And let me know if you think that you have a better Sever build. Obviously, there are much more optimal ways of playing a darkness build, a pure darkness build. Decrepify, minimum, you know, uptime on all cooldowns, just speed through everything. I totally get that. I'm not super interested in that. I'm super interested in creating a Sever build for the Sever identity to be able to use this super cool skill with my awesome, you know, Grim Reaper skeleton buddy. But if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear from you either down in the comments or in the Discord. The links are all down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. Again, I'm going to have the Maxroll guide up in the next day or two, but I just want to get this out to people. So I really appreciate you watching the video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.